Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to New Hampshire Next for Young Changemakers. If you're joining us for the first time, my name is Will Stewart, and I'm the Executive Director of Stay, Work, Play New Hampshire, which is a statewide nonprofit whose mission is to attract and retain more young people here in the Granite State. Our primary goal for New Hampshire Next is to inspire and educate young New Hampshire changemakers to work to create positive change in their communities and the state as a whole. So thank you all for joining us today and for your desire to help make New Hampshire a better place. Before we jump into today's session, I'd just like to take a moment to recognize and thank Dartmouth-Hitchcock Health for their sponsorship of New Hampshire Next. They're, of course, a leading employer across the state. They're also a great partner for Stay, Work, Play and many other organizations, nonprofit and otherwise, here in New Hampshire. And of course, they're also on the front lines these days in the battle against COVID-19. So for these reasons, we'd definitely like to thank Dartmouth-Hitchcock for their support today and for all that they do. Thank you. Today's installment, which is the second installment of New Hampshire Next, will look at how we can all work to make New Hampshire, one of the whitest states in the country, a more welcoming place for people of color, something that is absolutely necessary if we want to attract and retain more young people here. First, before we jump in, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background as to how we know this to be true. So back in December of 2017, Stay, Work, Play commissioned a survey of young people in New Hampshire that found that a lack of cultural diversity to be a reason for young people potentially leaving Granite State. Likewise, this past fall and winter, we heard similar themes as part of Stay, Work, Play's Policy and Pints series, in which we traveled to 9 locations all across the state to hear young people talk about the issues that are facing people in their respective regions. And one of the top 3 issues overall that was cited by attendees statewide was New Hampshire's lack of diversity, and that being a reason they might possibly leave New Hampshire. So as a result of the survey data and the Policy and Pints feedback, Stay, Work, Play is exploring ways in which we, all of us, as individuals, as organizations, as communities, and as a state, as an entire state, how we can all work to make New Hampshire more welcoming to people of color as a means of attracting and retaining the young talent our state needs to not just survive, but thrive. So today's conversation is really a first step, to help all of us, but especially those of us who are white, to learn more about the experiences of people of color here in New Hampshire so that we might be better informed as we seek to make New Hampshire a more welcoming place to diverse populations. We're going to get started here in just a moment. Just one little housekeeping item I wanted to touch upon. Before we get started, we're going to ask everyone if you could turn off your video in just a minute. That way we'd like to hide everyone else's screen so that we can highlight our panelists today so that we can all see them at the same time. So if you could do that right now, we would greatly appreciate it. Thanks. Would now like to introduce today's moderator, who will in turn introduce our panelists. Israel Piedra is an attorney and a state representative serving his first term in the state legislature in Concord. A New Hampshire native, is attended public schools in Milford before attending Bates College in Maine and then Boston College Law School. He is an associate at Welch, White and Fontaine, PC in Nashua, where he focuses his practice on general civil litigation. Among his professional accomplishments, he has argued several times before the New Hampshire Supreme Court, has been selected 3 times to the Super Lawyers magazine Rising Stars list, and has published articles in legal periodicals. Is was elected to the New Hampshire House of Representatives in 2018, representing Manchester's Ward 2. He serves on the House Committee on State Federal Relations and Veterans Affairs. So thank you to Is for guiding our conversation today, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Will, and thank you everyone for being here, especially our panelists. We've got a distinguished panel for you today, so I'm excited to get started into some of these questions. Before we do get started, please chime in the chat with questions. We do want to get those Q's and A's from you so we can discuss those at the end of our session. So use your chat feature, whether that's on your computer on the sidebar or on your phone at the bottom of the screen, if questions come up during the session. So with that, we'll get started. And panelists, if you could, it looks like your names are up there. So feel free to give us a wave when I say your name so everyone knows who I'm talking about. So first is Rabia Gandhi. She is a talent acquisition consultant at Dartmouth College. Born and raised in India, she worked in the Human Resources Division at ITC Hotels for 4 years before coming to the United States. Rabia is experienced in enabling various dimensions of HR, such as talent acquisition, onboarding, learning development, and other matters, and to perform their best by leveraging analytics and insights that drive outcomes. So thank you, Rabia, for joining us. Next is Diamond Legrand. Diamond moved from Virginia to Portsmouth with her 5-year-old just last year in order to hone their snow tubing skills and their New England accents. She's working as a membership coordinator and runs the Kids Club for New Hampshire PBS in Durham. She has a degree from Reynolds Community College and is working on her bachelor's degree. She loves Halloween and scary movies, showing off her new hometown and cooking for a kid with an adventurous palate. Thank you, Diamond. Next, we have Emerald Anderson Ford. And Emerald is a graduate of Georgia Southern University who went on to serve 2 volunteer years with City Year New Hampshire, and then later serve as the organization's recruitment manager for 3 years. It was at City Year New Hampshire that Emerald met her future husband and started developing her understanding of community organizing and equity strategy for marginalized populations. Emerald now serves as City Year New Hampshire's Senior Diversity Recruitment and Admissions Director. She is a small business owner, philanthropist, activist, mother, wife, and racial equity strategist. And she currently resides in Manchester with her husband, Damon, and their 2 young daughters, Cleo and Reed. So thank you, Emerald, and we look forward to talking with you.
Thanks, Israel.
Lastly, we have Dr. Jazz Jackson. He served as an Associate Dean of First Year Experience, Retention, and Special Programs at Southern New Hampshire University since 2016. And in this role, Dr. Jackson is a collaborative partner with every institutional division in the university, which entails ensuring a holistic, intentional student experience that equips Southern New Hampshire University learners with the knowledge and skills they need to successfully transition from college work and to achieve their academic goals. He works on strategic teams across the university to coordinate college-wide retention initiatives. And he lives by a quote by Mahatma Gandhi that he'd like to share. Live as if you were to die tomorrow, learn as if you were to live forever. Wise words. Thank you, Jazz. All right, so again, as we move into our discussion here, feel free to chime in the chat, and we will try to answer your questions either during the flow of the conversation, if that makes sense, or at the end if there are more questions then. So I did just read your bios, so I don't want to go over those again, but I did want to ask our panelists a little bit specifically about how they came to New Hampshire, whether you're a New Hampshire native or you came here recently, you've been here for a long time, what brought you here. So without going back over those bios completely, if each of you could elaborate a little bit on the New Hampshire connection, what brought you here, and I will start with Emerald.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. I do want to make a really quick correction on my bio. I serve as the Senior Equity Strategist for City Year Inc., not City Year New Hampshire. Much as I love City Year New Hampshire, I don't just work for them. I get to work for our entire national organization. But to answer the question, so City Year New Hampshire is actually what brought me to New Hampshire. I'm originally from Atlanta. As you heard, went to school in Southern Georgia, right outside of Savannah. And when I signed up Hampshire, I figured it was a place that was far enough away from home as a young person, that I could feel a little bit more autonomous in my choices. And then I was here for about 4.5 years before I left and moved back south to Charlotte, North Carolina. And that was in 2012. And then my family and I just moved back to Manchester last July. And that was due to the fact that we had a pretty strong community here because we had lived here for some years before. And there were just some career opportunity movements that came about, and it made sense for us to kind of dip our toe back into New England and see what it meant to be Granite Staters again. So we've been back for a little under a year, and I'm really excited to be here.
Excellent. We're very happy to have you. I'll turn now to Rabia, if you could chime in on this question.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everybody. As you know, my name is Rabia Gandhi, and I am currently working in Dartmouth College in HR as a talent acquisition consultant. I am only 3 years old in the country. I moved here in the start of 2017 to begin grad school. So I actually, Boston was the city I landed in first. I studied at Northeastern University and did my master's in human resource management and corporate communications, which was a 2-year program. And I did a couple of internships in between. And how I'm here is that my first full-time job right after school was at Dartmouth College. So that's how I landed up here now.
Excellent. And I'll go now to Jazz.
Hello, everyone. So, interesting enough, I had no idea that I'll be moving to New Hampshire. I had applied for many jobs. I completed my doctorate degree at Northeastern University in a hybrid online program. And once I finished my degree, I was looking for jobs. And there was this job open up at Southern New Hampshire University, and I thought it was an interesting job. So I applied with no intention on actually moving to New Hampshire. Just because I was like, who moves to New Hampshire? So I applied, and they actually called me in for an interview. And I said, you know what? I can give me a free trip to New Hampshire. And so I said, all right, I'll come in and interview for New Hampshire for the job. Applied for the role, and they made me an offer. So I was at the point, do I just move forward or do I decline the offer? So I've lived many different places throughout the world, and I say, you know what, I can probably try out New Hampshire for 5 years and see what happens. And I've been here 3.5 years and still making the best of it.
Excellent, excellent. And finally, I will ask Diamond if you could give us your thoughts on what brought you to New Hampshire and when.
Okay. Well, I had family up this way. That was pretty much the big seal. It's always been an offer since high school, come somewhere new, try something fresh, get a new perspective. And it's always something that was holding me back and keeping me at home. And then I had a little one, and I was like, you get stuck and you get complacent. Hey, let's see if this offer still stands. And let's just make the jump. Let's just go for it. And we did that last July. So we've been here since.
Great. To kind of elaborate on this point a little bit, and I'll go back to Jazz here. I was wondering how in general New Hampshire compares. You said you've lived several places. How does New Hampshire compare? Is it, besides the weather, is it different? Is it kind of the same? It's all the United States. What are the biggest differences you see coming up here?
Interesting enough, I absolutely hate the weather. I don't think I'll ever get used to it. As we're having a conversation, there is a lot of lack of diversity. I moved here, moving from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I really despise Cincinnati, Ohio, until I moved to New Hampshire and realized how much I had a I had a lot of privilege living in New Hampshire, from actual places to go that really serve minorities or people of color, things to do, from actually having access to a lot of things that we really need from a cultural perspective. I can tell you my first thing that I did when I applied for when I was looking for a job here was actually look for a barber. Being a man of color, you have to make sure you have your hair cut. So I was fortunately been able to find a barber shop here, and I've had the same barber since been here. But from a diversity perspective, that was an issue from actually having things to do that was directly related to my identity. There was lack of that, and really figuring out how to find community. There was really no way in which you can connect with people that look like you outside of being very intentional and through networking. And the challenge is that if you're not out in the open and you're not an extrovert, that it really prevents you from being able to engage with people.
How about you, Diamond? You also, or you said, moved from the South recently. Has it also been a challenge for you to connect with other people of color? And has there been other kind of changes or big differences that you've noticed?
Tremendous, actually. I didn't know that cultural shock was like an actual thing. Like I didn't know you could like experience that and it like be a physical element on yourself until I moved here. And it's like, whew, okay, what do I do? How do I move? And then regardless of how you move, it's how is that perceived now? So it's just culturally different, and like you said, a lack of diversity. And what prompted me to actually want to be on the panel was when I went to Policy and Pints, was hearing that my thoughts weren't just my thoughts. I was like, oh, it's not just me that feels this way. Wow, okay, so maybe I can find friends this way. Maybe we'll have like a shared trauma experience, like, oh yeah, remember when we didn't know anyone, now we know someone. So that was kind of like the kickstart to want to be a part of this. But then we got put in timeout. So now we're all home again. And it's back to square one of trying to, like you said, find a community. And having a kid helps because she kind of helps me. She's the bridge between me and other people who have children. But then it's not children of her race or anyone she can identify with or that could, relate to her on certain experiences or culturally wise. And I have a 5-year-old who doesn't have a filter. So he'll say it quite often, Mom, is it all white folks here? I'm like, no, there's some around. So it's been an experience for myself, but it's also been one to watch her have to go through it as well. The different diversity and I just appearance on a face value, walking out into the street and not being able to see someone that looks like you for days. It's kind of weird.
Right. And how about you, Rabia? Did you have, Diamond called it kind of a culture shock coming here? You said you were in Boston for a while. I guess, what was it? Do you see a noticeable difference between living in Boston and being up in New Hampshire? Did you have that similar kind of culture shock situation? How about that?
I sure did. I come from New Delhi, India, which as we know is the busiest city of India, one of the busiest cities. And I've lived in the heart of the city in New Delhi, and even in Boston, I was right in downtown. My college is in the heart of the city. So I was used to a very different lifestyle and I think my transition from New Delhi to Boston wasn't very hard except the weather, because Northeastern's a very diverse school. I had friends who were also from the same ethnic background as me. So I felt coming to New Hampshire was challenged also because I felt I was very much outside of my comfort zone. And not just, I think in general, transition to a new city is always difficult and has its set of challenges. But I had moved to an area I felt was much more isolated. And it took some time to know if there was anything happening, in say like in an Indian community. Was there a community here at all? Were there any activities happening? Where could I find some Indian people who or just people have a shared culture with? So that took some time and took some effort for me to kind of find out and explore. But I think I would give the credit to my team, my department, my division. They've been very helpful in helping me navigate through the resources that are available and kind of help me get through the initial phase until I felt I could be on my own and start exploring on my own.
Great. And I'll turn lastly to Emerald on this question. You have a little bit of a different situation because you were here for a while, it sounds like, and then you came back. When your first time here, thinking back, what was there, that culture shock? Were you able to make any inroads in getting by that? And then coming back, was it any different?
Yeah. I think I was so young. I was about 22. And so it feels like, although there may have been a culture shock, I think the wanderlust overtook that. So it didn't feel so strange for me when I initially moved here. I will say though, when I left, it was due to my spouse and I. We had just had our first child, and we had made the conscious decision that we did not want to raise Black children in New Hampshire. And so the leaving was like a very specific reasoning. We're like, we want to be closer to home, and there is nothing here as far as like understanding the supports that we would need, whether it's like making sure that we have hair products or whatever it is, in raising children here was not something that we thought was really viable. So when the opportunity for us to come back happened last spring, we really had to sit down and think through that, because now we had 2 Black children, and we're like, okay, so now like how what does this mean? How are we going to make this work? I think for our children, it has definitely been some adjustment periods here with regards to being here, because they've only known, Charlotte, North Carolina, like below the Mason-Dixon line. They've seen bigger cities. They understand like what it means to have to get on public transportation. They understand what it means to have people who look like them regularly, whether it be their teachers, whether it be in the politicians that they see for the city. The Charlotte mayor is a Black female. So like a Black woman mayor, and so like I think that were recognizing that. And then something just to speak a little bit to the physiological piece of it. Lots of melanin needs a lot of vitamin D, lots of sun, right? And I know that I suffer from seasonal affective disorder. And what I started to see was that my daughter was starting to suffer from it this winter, because just the weather itself here was such a change, and like her not getting the vitamin D that she needed from the sun. So like it's not just like the culture piece and like the building community piece. There's some physiological things that like take some time to adjust to, that I think we're starting to see again in ourselves, but definitely within our children.
That's very interesting. So, and Diamond, just to follow up on that, I don't know if you're the only other panelist that has children on here, but do you have any reservations or at least second thoughts when you were thinking about coming up here with a younger child, about raising a child up here?
I had those thoughts, but it was the opposite for me. I was curious to see how she would transition, what her upbringing would be like on the other side, because I had grown up in the South my entire life. I've lived there my entire life. I know what that looks like. I wanted to see if I give her a different environment, a different culture to experience, what that would do for her, So I was kind of more excited to see how she would grow. But then also, like she mentioned, it's a switch that we have to just watch them go through, because they don't even know they're going through it to articulate it to us yet. So, and we're trying to figure out what is this, where are these anxieties coming from as a parent, and you forget that, oh, okay, I did this change too. They're doing this change too with me. So it's definitely has another layer to it as a parent, especially when you don't want them to feel like they lose a sense of themselves or their identity in a place that doesn't have something that they can relate to, you know?
Yep, yep. So I'll change gears a little bit here, unless the panelists have anything else to add on those topics. I think a lot of people in New Hampshire probably do not have a good sense of what it's like to be a person of color in New Hampshire, obviously because they're not people of color, but also because they may not have many friends of color or, you know, associates or whatever. So what's one thing that, to the panelists, that you wish that a white person in New Hampshire knew about the experience of people of color here in the state? And I'll start with Jazz, if you could address that, if there's anything in particular you wish our white friends knew about living in New Hampshire as a person of color.
A great question. My first statement is adapting to New Hampshire is not easy. Some of the statements by the other panelists have indicated different family stages. Being a single person of color, it was definitely a challenge. There was a sense of isolation moving here in October, and so without knowing anyone, it's tremendously hard. And there's not a roadmap of what do you do to assimilate yourself within a community that doesn't look like you. So it's quite challenging. It's hard to find community. It's hard to find places where you feel alive, in which you can be your authentic self. And so even when you're in the workplace, there's a level of you have to show up a certain way, but you want to go home in which you want to be in a space and connect with people who understand and appreciate who you are, where you can be your full authentic self.
Absolutely. And I'll ask Rabia if you could chime in. I don't know if there's anything you feel that you wish people in New Hampshire knew about your particular situation, just being a person of color here in general, whether you feel or you notice that there are, you know, differences in your mindsets from white people in New Hampshire, anything like that.
Yes, I think from what we just discussed, that definitely being a person of color and moving to this area can be very difficult, since it's already you know, fairly isolated town, and on top of that you feel that, you know, you could feel like you're the odd one out. I think just something that pops up in my head the first that I think of this is that when I moved here, I came with those same set of apprehensions and nervousness around, you know, not finding, you know, people of, say, my ethnicity, or not having a lot of things to do. For example, going to a Hindu temple that I was used to going back in Boston and especially India. But what helped me is that my team, or just the community that I was surrounded with, were very empathetic and really valued my perspective, respected my roots and where I came from, and just overall were very compassionate. So all in all, I think they went an extra mile to make sure that I was made to feel comfortable. So I think especially in this area, you know, we as, you know, people of color can do need that extra, you know, that time and that extra effort to just so that, you know, we can fit into the area and settle easily.
Absolutely. So kind of on this point, and I'll go to Emerald here. What can white people in New Hampshire do to make people of color feel more welcome or feel more as part of the community than perhaps they do now?
Sure.
Or is it a question, sorry to interrupt, or is it a question of just reaching a critical mass of more people of color in New Hampshire so that it's not such a unique situation to be a person of color here? That may be part of it as well.
Yeah, and that's something that you know, we as individuals can't control, right? Like what that critical mass looks like. And frankly, just because there's a critical mass of folks of color in New Hampshire does not mean that folks are going to feel welcomed. So I still think that it's two different questions. I think one of the biggest things I want to acknowledge here with this panel, which probably seems like it would be counterintuitive, but is that people of color is an all-encompassing phrase. And so we still have to make sure that we understand what it means to be a Black American, what it means to be a migrant or an immigrant, right? Like what it means to be biracial in the country. Like these are, and it's okay to have a conversation talking about each of those identity pieces. So I think one of the first things I would say is stop lumping us all together because we have different cultural needs. And I just would like to put that out there. I do understand for the sake of conversations like this, why it's done this way. But even as you start to have conversations about like resources in the community, those are gonna look different based off of those identity pieces. And so to try to lump all of that together is really doing anybody who was native to New Hampshire or who was a transplant a really big disservice, making us feel comfortable because you're still not looking to identify who we are within our individual ethnic and racial identities. So that's a long answer, but that's probably one of the first things I would say is just understand those differences and don't be afraid to talk about those differences, because within the person of color community, we talk about them and we're trying to understand like what that looks like. So how do we support one another while really affirming those individual ethnic and racial?
Okay, and Jazz, it sounds like Emerald saying this is not a easy process. It's not a magic bullet that we can, come up with some solution to the problem of making people of color feel more welcome here. And it's also kind of potentially a long process. Do you agree with that? And is there anything in particular that you could think of that would make the state more welcoming people of color?
So I definitely agree with Emerald. The challenge lies there's no silver bullet. There's a lot of employers looking to hire diverse talent, but hiring diverse talents and getting them here is just the first stage. There's multiple facets that we have to think about, and that comes from what does the onboarding look like? Have you develop mentorships and champions that can help these individuals navigate through their organization? Are there programs within the community in which they can be able to get support? Are there employee resources in which they can be able to have a space in which they can advocate? Where can they be involved within their community from a state and local representation, as well as how can organizations in the actual state hold some of these organizations accountable from a funding perspective to help and support and thinking about what diversity looks like? How do we identify measures, and how do we make sure we identify a way in which we're getting qualitative data to understand the voices of the people from all different identities, not just people of color, within that grouping as Emerald indicated.
Rabia, do you agree with that? Is there anything in particular that you would like to see that would make you or other people of color feel more comfortable, more welcoming in this state? Or is it just a complicated, long process?
There's one thing, in all honesty, what I felt initially was, I know that ultimately I was able to find out about networking groups or communities that did exist, especially for people of color or different ethnic groups that did exist. But there was nothing that was readily available to me or made available to me initially. So I think what's important is that if there are resources out there, they're publicized and they're spoken about publicly, that any new person has access to it and finds out about these resources at a starting stage and doesn't have to kind of really go through the struggle of exploring and finding out. For
sure. Okay. I'm going to move into a little bit of the questions that we're having coming in here. And I apologize if I skip your question or miss your question. There's a lot of things happening in the chat, both online and offline. And I think some of these answers from the questions we just had has addressed some of them. But one thing one question I wanted to address was, to our panelists, do you feel like there are opportunities or it's realistic to move into or get involved into leadership positions in the community as a person of color? If you felt, or maybe, I don't know, you can tell us if you already are involved in those capacities, whether they're, community organizations, boards, political things. Do you feel like that would be a difficult thing to get into because of your background? Do you feel like there is a desire from other folks for you to get involved? So I'll ask Diamond first whether you feel like that your background would be a barrier to those things, whether it's hard to get into with our background, whatever.
I think that would, for me, because I'm still relatively new, that would be a bit jumping the gun. It would be first for me to have to feel like I'm a part of the community, to then want to be a part of those organizations. And overall, I think what we're saying is the lack of diversity makes us feel not a part of the community. So yes, we want to be in the position to be a part of those organizations and be in the leadership positions to voice the resources that we find available, and to voice our opinions on how to take the group and then dissect it from who we are as individuals and ethnicities and people of color. But I think first we would have to feel like we are integrated into the community. We would have to feel welcome. Yes, I feel welcomed here, but I don't feel invited. And that's a completely different thing. You can show up to a party and be welcomed at that party because you're someone's +1, or you just heard about the party and you're there. But was I invited here? Do I feel warm when I'm welcomed here? It's a different thing for me. And I think that's what the disconnect for me is.
And James McKim chimes in on chat. Is there, you mentioned being integrated into the community or not being integrated. Is there anything in particular that would help in that regard? Or does that just kind of go back to what we were talking about previously, about it not being a simple thing?
It's not a simple thing. I think it would be simple enough to say, hey, I'm a mom, I'm going to integrate into this rec center because my child's going to play a sport here. So that'll make me a part of this community because I show up to these events on the weekends, my kid participates. But then I show up, but now I'm the only person of color at these events, and my daughter played soccer this summer, and we were there, but it was me standing here trying to engage, and it always felt a little, while I'm trying to be a part of this community, I'm not really here, So I don't know how to explain it, the feeling of being able to feel as though your community is your community. I don't know, I guess it's just it could be a mental division for myself, having to decide that I can make a community here, even though it's not as diverse as what I'm used to my community looking like, Maybe I have to take that mental block from myself as well. Who knows?
Understood. And I'm going to ask Jazz to chime in, going back to the question about leadership positions in the community. This is a question from Yaz on the chat. I think it's an interesting question that in order to break down some of these barriers or stigmas, it ideally, people of color would have more of a leadership role in some of our institutions and organizations. Does it feel like, Jazz, that's a realistic option? Does it, and if not, is it because of, is it because you're a person of color? Or is it because you haven't been in the community for very long? What do you think about that?
I think there's multiple aspects for this. within your current organization, I think there's always a glass ceiling. You can bring people in within your organization, but if you don't have the sponsors being able to advocate for you within the organization, then your voice is not going to be heard, and people are not going to be able to see the value in which you bring. While we continue to talk about diversity as a positive with moving organizations forward, there's still a systemic problem which diverse people are not promoted as fast. When you think about outside of the community, I think there's opportunity to be engaged and be a part of the leadership within the community. However, there's no clear blueprint of what that looks like. If you're not connected with people who've been here already and can give you an insight on what are the possibilities, then you won't be able to. I've been involved and went through the New Leaders Council, and I'm actually currently a part of the Equity Leadership Fellowship, which has really been insightful, where I'm actually sitting on a board within New Hampshire. The question would be is, would I be on a board if I hadn't went through that program? Probably not, because I wouldn't have known how to be able to navigate that space to get there. And so even within being on the board, the program is set up to bring minorities and diversities on boards, but I'm sitting on a board where my champion is a white man who's extremely intelligent and has been able to provide me a lot of insight. However, for me, I'm still in the space in which I'm a minority. So not only am I learning, I'm trying to find my voice to be able to bring value to the conversation.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask this question that's raised by Sarah to Emerald, if I could. I think it's an interesting question. She asks if there's any advice the panelists might offer to white parents trying to ensure their children are exposed to various cultures. Do you have any thoughts on that, Emerald? If you could chime in.
Absolutely. That is a really good question. I do just want to take a quick moment to double back on something that Jazz was mentioning with regards to kind of finding your place, whether it's in political leadership or just community leadership. I just wanted to add that not only do you have to have those champions and those networks, when it comes to being somebody who represents a marginalized group of people, and this is no matter where you are in the country, in the world, you have to make sure that just because you were invited to the table, that your voice is actually going to be listened to and paid attention to. So I can have all the champions in the world. I can have everybody wanting me on their boards, on their task force, which they do because everybody wants that diversity hire kind of met. But are my ideas going to be taken seriously? Am I going to be looked at as somebody who understands needs of the people just because all the people don't look like me? There are all these other questions that then you have to wrestle with to figure out, just because I'm here, does it actually matter? Am I being listened to? Am I able to help represent folks who aren't typically listened to? So I just kind of wanted to add that point out there. With regards to your children, it's so interesting, right? Something that my husband and I recognized, and this is when we were in Charlotte, North Carolina. So ethnically and racially a bit more diverse than Manchester, New Hampshire. And we recognized that our kids can see us work with folks who look different than us, that our kids can see us, be polite and speak to people out in public who look different from us. But what our kids actually notice is who we invite into our home. And that was something that stuck with me. Who do we actually invite into our home to break bread with, to sit down to a meal to? Who do we feel comfortable enough with to have them in our space like that? And I think that is one of those lessons that you don't realize your children are seeing, because those passing moments, while they may be pleasant, they are just that. They are passing moments. And so children can see that, and they can pick up on the niceness and so on and so forth. But what does it mean to truly trust somebody who was different from you? What does it mean to truly feel like somebody who is different from you is actually a part of your family, of your ecosystem? Who we invite into our homes. And so I think that's something that my husband and I have been very intentional with since we've become parents, is our circle is filled with people who are so very different from us. And that's due to a lot of different dimensions of diversity, not just race and ethnicity. And we make sure that we are intentional about our daughters being exposed to people who are different from them in their own home, to understand what that means and what it means to truly have that type of relationship and to learn from one another. So that's just one of those very intentional pieces, but it starts with who you are actually connecting with. You can't just be inviting everybody to your house, right? So who are you connecting with in a way that allows for that to happen, for your children to truly see a relationship flourish?
Very well said. Thank you. And Diamond, I see you shaking your head over there. Do you agree with those thoughts as far as what a parent can do?
Yeah. I wish I had those words. I completely agree with them. It's definitely that sentiment exactly. I couldn't say it any better. I couldn't even add anything to it. So yes, I definitely agree with you there.
Fair enough. So we just had this question come in from Emmett. I think it's also an interesting question. There are probably misconceptions and myths from people back home about New Hampshire, or maybe things they didn't even realize that were different about New Hampshire that you've had to tell them about. Rabia, is there anything in particular that you had to illuminate family or friend about back home about New Hampshire that they may not have realized already?
I think one thing that comes on top of my head is that back in Boston, if I compare it with Boston, I did not see people or hear people talk too much about, ethnic groups or racism per se. But I feel like they're much more difficult topics over here, and I find people tiptoeing around the topic, and that ultimately makes me feel more secluded, more ostracized than I really should. So I think it is very important to strike the right balance between being sensitive to people of color, but at the same time you don't want to overdo it, because the person of color finds it more difficult to merge with the group. So I think it's a balance that you have to maintain, and that was something new that I got to know here after moving here.
That's an interesting comment, and Jazz, I wanted to elaborate on that a little bit. When you are, having been here a little while now, when you are among white people or people who aren't of color, are you consciously self-conscious about that? Is it what's the frequency of your consciousness about it, if that makes sense?
I think that's a great question. I'm always conscious of it. Working in higher education and construction prior to this, I've always been in spaces in which I'm usually the only minority. So I have to be very, very intentional about what I say. I try my best to be authentic, but because of the perception that people have for men of color, it's very challenging, because if I say exactly what I want to say straightforward, then I'm labeled as an angry Black man. And so, or I've been giving feedback that I'm too nice. So there's a balancing act in how do I show up and be effective and being impactful in what I'm doing. But it becomes extremely exhausting. I'm exhausted when I get home, because I have to put on these faces and make people comfortable, when the only thing I want to do is be my authentic self, which makes them uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And staying with you for a second, Jazz, Molly on chat asks if there are any existing business groups or affinity groups which an employer or a colleague could refer a person of color to that might be of assistance.
So yeah, there is a Millennials People of Color group within New Hampshire. You can look it up on Facebook. That was started by two millennials. You may not be an employee of SNHU People of Color, but we have a SNHU People of Color group that was started by myself and a chief diversity officer. We also have a supper club, which was started by some transplants or native within New England. If you want to connect with that, you could just shoot me an email, jjackson5@snhu.edu. And then if you want to grow as a leader, only thing that I know of that focus specifically on minorities is the Equity Leadership Fellow that I actually found out through someone that I met through the Millennials of Color. So those are all that I know of. There's not one place that you can find this information. It's really been meeting the right people and getting the voice out. This past October, I actually held a networking event for communities of color coming together in New Hampshire, where it brought about 75 people together just to build coalition and community, and actually had one scheduled for April 16th of this year, but it was canceled because of COVID-19. But if you can meet the right people, you can get it, but there's no specific resource. I just had to navigate the space and connect with the right people.
Okay, so folks, we're almost out of time here. I wanted to ask our panelists if they had any final thoughts. I'll give everyone a chance to talk for a few seconds if you'd like. I apologize to those who chimed in the chat and we weren't able to get to your questions. So thank you all. And we're gonna ask the panelists. I'll start with Diamond. Did you have anything you wanted to add before we sign off here?
No, I feel like there was so much that was just left untouched. But I definitely want to just piggyback on what Jazz is saying. It's like if there can be a space where outside of your home that you can build where you're allowed to take off your business casual self, because that's what I call it. Like when I leave the house in the morning, I put on my business casual self and I'm her all day. And the only space I have to not be her is when I'm home, because there's this, like he mentioned, there's this perception from outside and there's these looks and in the workspace, I have to be me, but a palatable version of me. Because one, I have to be professional because it's a workspace, and then two, because I am the only person of color in my workspace. So it just makes it, it's a fine line that has to be maneuvered at all times. So when you come home and you feel like you can decompress, you can take it off, and that's that. And I would love to find a space that's not my home, but in my home, in my area, that I can do the same, you know? So that's it.
Thank you very much. Emerald, I'll come to you now if there's any closing thoughts you have.
Yeah, sure. So I'll just say, as I like the term boomerang, as somebody who boomeranged back to New Hampshire, there are a lot of really great things about what it means to live here. And I think about the fact that the choice to live here has given us the opportunity for us to, like, you know, be 4 hours away and take our girls out of the country, like to Canada, and like to see something different. We just got back from a nice weekend vacation up in the Lakes region, and like having that opportunity where you know, 2 weeks ago we were walking alongside the beach, right? And so I want to acknowledge that, like, there is history and there are things here that are really fantastic, and the exposure that we're able to give our family has been really exciting. There was a question that was put in the chat that I want to acknowledge, though, this idea about what it means to care for our mental health when we don't see people who look like us, and some of the experiences that we need are not readily available. And when we have to continue to have this conversation, it is tough. And something that I always tell people is, if you have to go online to find a counselor who looks like you, who can better understand your needs, that is completely fine. But I always encourage people to find somebody to speak to who can kind of help reflect back their experiences. So that way, when you are decompressing and trying to understand, you don't have to also explain the experience. And so it really is a balancing act, but I think that there is community here. You can get involved. To Jazz's point, you just kind of have to know where to go, and then help to continue to build it for other folks.
Thank you. Rabia, I'll turn to you now.
So I would want to thank Stay Work Play for being a new person over here. It's very comforting to know that there is an organization that is out there to, you know, take care of you, or to, you know, address the concerns that you thought wouldn't be addressed otherwise. So all in all, I think just want to thank you for you know, initiating this panel discussion on this topic today, and just thank you for just the general efforts that you've all made.
Thank you. And Jazz, finally, I'll go to you if you have any thoughts.
So my final thoughts is we as a people of color were resilient, and so that resilient definitely requires for us to be adaptable. There's systemic things that are in the world, not just within New Hampshire, that we have to overcome, that we just have to be able to adapt and just to make the best of it. Because I've lived in many different places, it really has allowed me to be able to adapt. So building community is essential. Scheduling meetings with people who can actually fill your cup. I have regular meetings with mentors all throughout New Hampshire that really help me be able to navigate the space. And just self-care. While I love New Hampshire offers definitely diversity, being close to beaches, mountains, different places to visit. I take vacations away. Sometimes you just need to get away to relax, regroup, and reflect. So yeah, final thoughts.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to toss it back to Will now. Thank you from myself and all our panelists, and I'll turn it back to Will for some closing remarks.
Thank you, Wiz, and a big thanks to all of our panelists for sharing their thoughts, their ideas, and their experiences with us this afternoon. As someone just mentioned, I believe it was Jay in the comments, this is just getting started, and we're just really scratching the surface of what this is all about. But as everyone who's here can, I think, attest, it's a very thought-provoking conversation with a lot of good suggestions that I hope we can all heed as we work to make New Hampshire a more welcoming place for everyone. As Sarah mentioned in the comments, given that the number of questions that are continuing to come on chat, we thought we'd keep this room open for another 15 minutes or so at the conclusion of today's broadcast, just so we can continue the conversation. For anyone who wants to stick around, don't feel like you have to, but if you want to stick around and talk with any of your fellow panelists, or I should say any of your fellow attendees, feel free to do so. Our panelists are certainly welcome to stick around, but recognize that they have very busy schedules and a lot of things to do too. So we certainly appreciate their time and your time for taking an hour out of your afternoon today to listen in and engage on this very important topic of conversation. Would certainly like to thank Representative Israel Piedra for his excellent moderation of today's conversation. You did a great job, and I don't know if you're seeking re-election this fall, but as your constituent, I sure hope you do, and good luck if that is the case. And as a final thank you, I'd like to express our gratitude once again to Dartmouth-Hitchcock Health for their sponsorship of New Hampshire Next, a summit for young changemakers. While I have everyone here for just a couple of more seconds, just wanted to throw in a plug for Stay Work Play's Rising Stars Awards. You may be familiar with these, kind of our signature annual event in the fall, but nominations are now open. And this is a great opportunity to recognize remarkable individuals under the age of 40 here in New Hampshire for their contributions to their local communities and or the state as a whole. We have a number of different categories, from college and high school students to entrepreneurs to civic leaders to our kind of the pinnacle, the young person of the year. So we're using a new two-step process to nominate folks this year in the individual award categories. And step one must be completed by Friday, May 29th. So we have just about a month left to go in order for folks to be considered for the award. So you can learn more at stayworkplay.org/Rising Stars Awards. So with that, as I mentioned, today is the second installment. We're meeting every day, doing something every day this week as part of New Hampshire Next. So tomorrow at 2 o'clock on Wednesday, 2 o'clock, I hope you'll join us for the next session of New Hampshire Next. It's entitled Long Story Short, and tomorrow's segment will feature 4 fast-paced, super interesting presentations from 4 incredible young New Hampshire changemakers who are making New Hampshire better via entrepreneurship, community building, sustainability, and the arts. It's going to be a great day, and you do not want to miss it. With that, thank you again for joining us. Feel free to stick around if you want to have a chat. You'll talk more about this conversation today. But with that, have a great day, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.